This is Ray Dunlap from Dunlap and Associates Wealth Management here in Peachtree City, Georgia. And we get questions periodically about different financial topics, and I just wanted to address one today that comes up more frequently than you'd think. We hear about the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500, and people have asked me, what exactly does that mean? So I wanted to give you a little background on what some of these indices are, how they were created, and how important they are. Well, let's start with the Dow Jones Industrial Average because that's actually the oldest gauge of stock market performance. And in 1896, Charles Dow, who was the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, and one of his statisticians, Edward Jones, actually came up with this concept to measure how stocks are performing. And interestingly, when it came out in 1896, they only picked 12 companies. And most of those were railroads because railroad was the dominant industry in the United States in the late 19th century. This changed over time, and in 1928, they increased the number of stocks in the Dow Jones Industrial Average to 30. And that's where it stands today. And it's supposed to be 30 companies that represent kind of a slice of Americana. So they aren't the 30 biggest companies, but they're 30 companies that represent different industries, different sectors, and it gives us a fairly good gauge of how the stock market is doing. But it's only 30 companies. So it is a very narrow way to look at stock market performance. In 1957, the S&P 500 was created as a way to look at a more broad index of stocks. And as the name indicates, there are 500 companies, not 30, in the S&P 500. And these are the 500 largest industrial corporations in the United States. And it does give us an additional measurement of how the stock market is doing. And because it's broader, it probably is a little bit more impactful to look at the S&P 500 rather than the Dow, because the Dow is just 30 stocks. But both of them are indices that are referred to on TV and on radio and in the newspaper. So when you hear the Dow did this or the S&P 500 did that, it's important to understand that they are not the same thing, that they measure different companies and different performance. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, again, 30 companies, the S&P 500, 500 companies. Then in 1971, the NASDAQ exchange was created. And so you will hear sometimes people refer to, well, how did the NASDAQ do? Well, the NASDAQ started out as what are called over-the-counter stocks, tend to be smaller companies that trade less frequently, and these were done kind of off the books. They didn't trade on one of the exchanges. An exchange like the New York Stock Exchange or the American Stock Exchange is where the majority of stocks trade, but there were a lot of smaller companies, especially in the technology area, that did not qualify to meet the minimum standards in terms of net worth of the company to make the exchange. And so the NASDAQ exchange was created specifically so people could trade those smaller companies. And that has turned into another index. You'll hear that the NASDAQ did this or the NASDAQ did that. Well, the NASDAQ is actually 3,300 companies, but they tend to be smaller. They tend to be more heavily weighted towards technology, but it is a different way to gauge and measure stock market performance. So we have the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we have the S&P 500, and we have the NASDAQ. There are also indices that measure how foreign investments are doing. And so all of these different indices give us a way that we can look at trends in the marketplace and to be able to compare and contrast how things have changed over the years. Now, the S&P 500 is easy, 500 companies. And so what happens is companies will fall off that list and other companies will come on that list. And so they're making changes to that list on an ongoing basis. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, because it's the brainchild of the Wall Street Journal, they will change the composition of the Dow Jones Industrial Average periodically. And so as an example, we now have a restaurant in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. McDonald's was added about 9 years ago. there was no restaurant, because remember, we started out with mostly railroads. Well, that morphed, and you had companies like General Motors and General Electric. And over time, those companies and the composition of that index has changed. But it still gives us a fairly good idea of how to compare and contrast how stocks have performed in different eras. And so when you hear these things on the television and you hear them referred to, I just wanted to give you kind of a sense of how these indices were derived, how important they are, and whether or not to take a grain of salt with what these commentators say. So hopefully this was some information that was helpful for you. And obviously, if you ever have questions about this or anything else related to finance, our phone lines are always open, our email's always ready, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.